content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, sensitive topics, and explicit language that may be triggering, offensive, or sensitive subjects to some viewers and listeners. Discretion is advised. The purpose of this podcast is to explore and discuss true crime cases for entertainment and educational purposes only. This podcast does not intend to glorify or sensationalize crime, but rather aims to analyze and understand the complexities of human behavior in the criminal justice system. We encourage listeners to approach this content with empathy, critical thinking, respect for the victims and their families. A city already fighting crime, poverty, and neglect is about to face something darker, something no one else sees coming. Women began disappearing along the stretch of Woodward Avenue, their bodies turning up days later dumped and discarded in abandoned buildings. Their voices forever silenced, except one. One woman survives, and her story cracks open the case of the fastest, most brutal serial killer I ever heard of. Now, Benjamin Atkins, a.k.a. the Crack City Strangler, left behind a trail of horror, but also reveals the deep cracks in the system that fail to protect the most vulnerable. So let's peer into one of Detroit's darkest chapters. And with that being said, it's time to start the show. Let's hit it. Hi, welcome to another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. I am your host, Winnie Schrader. I wanted to Google who's killed like the most people in the shortest amount of time, basically. And then I came across this name, Benjamin Tony Atkins. You heard of him? Because I haven't. And then I was going through and I'm like, okay, well, maybe let me see if there was a book on it. And I found a book called The Crack City Strangler, the Homicide Serial Killer Benjamin Atkins, book number 2 in the Murder in the Motor City series. So I reached out to the author, B.R.Bates, and I'm like, hey, I want to talk about this case because I have never heard of it. And there's a lot more than just him killing. He at minimum killed at least 12 women in under a year. So basically like one a month. But there's probably more out there. So I'd like to welcome B.R.Bates to the show. I'm going to call her Billy because BR, that's just kind of weird, but I'd like to welcome BR to the show. Hello, Billy.
Hi there. Thank you very much. I have to compliment you. I love the tone and feel of this podcast. In the intro, I felt like I was watching a movie and I just wanted to see more.
Oh, that's thank you so much. I have to give credit to my our longtime buddy Bart-El for creating that intro video for me and the music. So when I came across this, I had no idea, but you obviously, you know what you're talking about because you are a veteran journalist and author. You basically more focus on pop culture, but you have over 12 books, several ebooks. I mean, you have a lot of, credentials and credibility when it comes to journalism. The Crack City Strangler. Now, Crack City, we all know it, Detroit. That was kind of a very targeted area that the crack and cocaine epidemic really hit Detroit hard, especially during this time period. Now, Benjamin Tony Atkins, he was the fastest serial killer by murdering at least 12 women in under a year. And they found these women along Detroit's infamous Cass Corridor. Is that kind of like a major freeway that goes through Detroit?
Actually, it's a region of the city of downtown. Benjamin Atkins killed along Woodward Avenue, and Woodward meets the Cass Avenue and what they call the Cass Corridor. So it's all very close to each other. But yeah, sometimes it's referred to as the Cass Corridor and sometimes the Woodward Corridor.
Okay. So as you delved into this case, you started finding things that seemed to have, like, he fell through the cracks in so many places, with, systematic failures. I mean, probably just in the last maybe 10 years, mental illness has kind of, the stigma has kind of come off of it a little bit, and like, we're okay to talk about things like that. But back then, nobody had the mental health care that we have today. So a lot of people fell through the cracks there. So yeah, if you want to talk about Crack City, that's what I'm thinking about. But he was a predator. But what caused him to be like this? Like, did he have a troubled childhood? I mean, it's not normal, especially being an African American male, to be a serial killer, because that's just kind of out of the norm when it comes to textbook serial killers. Normally, they're about, white men about 35 to 48 years old, so you don't see this. Maybe give us a little backstory on Tony and his childhood, and maybe we can kind of see where things went wrong for him.
Yeah, he definitely goes against the stereotype of the serial killer, which has traditionally been a white male. He did have a very troubled childhood. He was born in the late 1960s and never had a dad in the picture. The dad, he and his brother was a year older than him. The two boys, they never knew his father because the dad left when Benjamin was 2 years old. And at that point, his mom, Judy, their mom, they were all living in Ohio, and she came back to Michigan because that's where she originally was from. And so she came back and she was living with her mom in Michigan and Detroit for a while. But the troubles really began, I think, the fact that his mom had been a heroin addict and she had been working prostitution since she was a teenager. In fact, she had an unplanned pregnancy when she was a teenager. Benjamin referred to it later as he had a couple siblings he didn't know who were trick, as he called it, but his mom had a very troubled life. And so coming back to Michigan with two young boys, she was doing her thing, and she was very honest about that in later years, what she was doing, working the streets and all that. Benjamin told police at the time of his arrest that he had memories of being in the back seat of a car with his brother while his mom was in the front seat with a client. So it's just really sad. Things started out, that way for him at a very young age. And at one point, Judy left the two boys with someone that she knew. Not necessarily a family member or a close friend, just someone, I think, where she was living at the time, like a neighbor or something. And so she left them in this other person's care and went off on her own. And it was discovered by authorities that these two boys had been left by their mom. And so they became wards of the county. And at that point, they went into the foster care system, and they went into a series of a few different foster homes over the next several years. And the boys, probably you could say they didn't adjust very well to that. They were having some issues. They were skipping school. They were wandering off on their own. They were running away, and the foster mom would have to call police and have them track down a few streets over and bring them home. And so things like this were happening. And in fact, in one of the foster homes, the mom said that Benjamin was setting fires. Ding, ding, ding. We all know that from the McDonald triad for serial killers. So this went on for a few years. And then when Benjamin was 9 years old, almost 10 years old, the two boys were placed at an inner city home for boys. And that had a very big effect on Benjamin because he claimed later to police that he was abused by one of the male employees at that home for boys. And because that home for boys had had lots of allegations like that come up, in fact, it was closed down in later years. in the wake of a lot of allegations that came out in the 1980s. And Ben and his brother were there in the 1970s. But there's no reason not to believe Ben about what happened there with this male employee because of the allegations that came out later from many other people. So he had a horrible experience there. After 2 years at the home, he and his brother were discharged into the care of his mom again because his mom had been working with social workers. She had been working to get a stable home for the boys. She had a boyfriend at one point after they had been there a couple years at the home. She had a boyfriend who had a pretty good job, and so she had a decent place to live, and she was building a foundation to bring the boys back home. She was always wanting to do that, and the boys were very much wanting to be reunited with their mom, no matter what the circumstances, no matter what their memories were of their mom's activities. The boys, at least Benjamin, was very insistent in later years that he wanted to be back with his mom. He saw himself, his brother, and his mom as sort of an us against the world scenario, like the three of us together, there's nothing that we can't do type of thing. That's one of the psychologists' assessment who had taken like some time with Benjamin after his arrest to psychologically assess him. So then at that point, after 2 years, the two boys went back to live with their mom, but things were really not any better. The boyfriend was out the door. There was other boyfriends that came in and out, and very unstable situation there. In fact, one of Judy's boyfriends, Ben said later, sold him into with some other guy that he knew. So really bad situation.
Gross.
Judy was off doing her own thing still. And Judy had some trouble with the law too. She had been incarcerated for a little while, for a couple years, for some crimes. I want to say like a check writing scheme she had done. She had served a little bit of time for that while the boys were in the foster system. So, oh my gosh. I mean, just recipes for disaster right and left everywhere you look. But things did get worse for Ben because when he was a teenager, trying to stay at his mom's place, and his mom is not anywhere to be found. There's no good father figure in the picture at all. As his brother later said, the two boys were left to their own devices as teenagers. And so Ben got involved with drugs, different kinds of drugs over the next few years. And he learned that he could get money on the street with his body. And so he started doing sex work himself, as his mother had done. Yeah, he was scoring some cash with men doing sex work on the street. And so then things escalated for him over the next several years, and he started getting deeper and deeper into that street life. And so he became an adult, and he was really homeless. He would live here sometimes. He would live there sometimes. His brother had a girlfriend and was staying at a place, and sometimes Ben would crash on their couch for a little while. Then he would disappear, and they had no idea where he went. So that was Ben's life. He was homeless, and he was scoring drugs. He was getting cash with men doing sex work, and then taking the money and buying drugs. And then at that point, the cycle was when he got high on crack, he would go find a female, and he'd be trying to walk it off, but he'd lure the female off somewhere saying, "Hey, I got something to smoke. Let's go smoke it." And then things would go bad, and the female would end up dead. And so this is how the murders began. There were a couple attacks before his first murder. So this is how the cycle repeated. He would go home, sleep for a while, get up the next day or the next evening, and do it all over again. So just a crazy life that he led on Woodward Avenue.
So when he started murdering the women, was there any men that could have possibly been his victims, or was he just focusing that anger towards just women only?
He was focusing his anger on the women, definitely. And as
Okay.
a couple cops who worked the case said, he was killing his mother over and over again because he looked for a certain type. He looked for a drug-addicted female of color doing sex work. All of the females, all 11 females he killed, and then the 2 others he attacked, they all fit that demographic, all of those characteristics, and that matched his mom. And so it was determined that it was really about his mom. I don't think he realized that. He loved his mom very much. He told people that, and his mom loved him too. Atkins' defense attorney talked to his mom and saw her as a very concerned mom at the time of the case when all of this was coming out. So it's just a weird, complicated relationship. But yeah, when he encountered men, it was just to get cash. And he claimed to be gay. I don't know that he was gay. I wonder if he would be considered bisexual. I have no idea. Really, only he might have known. And I think he was very confused and conflicted about his sexual orientation.
Yeah, and especially during that time period for men, especially I don't know much about that time period for women, but I know men they were very ostracized for being gay. A lot of men were still in the closet, married men with
Yeah.
children, and it just. And especially being in living in the circumstances that he grew up in, being poor, homeless, possibly gay or bisexual, prostitution. I mean, it's just, yeah, it's a definite recipe for disaster. And, and having the drug element in there just makes it even worse. It's like throwing a match in a gas can, you know what I mean? So he starts murdering these women, and they're kind of all similar. When I look at serial killers like that, especially when there's that angst against their mother, it's almost like they're mad at their mother because they want to love them, but they hate them at the same time it's like he blames his mom for his life, but then he's mad at himself for hating her. You know what I mean? It's just that confliction.
I think you've got something there. I think there's some of that going on. He also hated himself for his behavior on the street and his conflict over his sexual orientation too, and he talked about that. He was actually evaluated by 4 different psychologists in the time between his arrest and his trial, in about a year and a half's time, and they each had a little bit different take on him, but they talked about all kinds of things. And one thing that came out for Atkins is he carried a lot of guilt over his work in the streets, over his work in doing sex work and with men. And that's where he claimed to hear voices after his arrest too. He claimed to hear voices, but he said the dominant voice, who he called Tony, his street name that he went by, Atkins' street name, was also this alternate voice within him named Tony. And he specifically said that Tony would berate him for his homosexual behavior. He would berate him and egg him on and tell him to go get a female and then tell him to rape and kill the female. So just crazy stuff going on in his head.
Oh my gosh. Okay, so when he got arrested, and what was the what was the actual charge that he was indicted with? Was it just like capital murder, life without parole? What was kind of the charge that he was facing when he went to trial?
When he was arrested, he did confess to killing all 11 women. In fact, he gave the police a female victim who had not been discovered yet. So they knew they had their guy, because he said, oh, there's one you haven't found yet. And he directed them there. And then they found the 11th person. And then he confessed to attacking one person who survived. Her name was Darlene. And so for all 12 of those cases at the time, now he is known to have attacked one other person who did not come on the radar at all. Then she wasn't known about. She was very young, and she was attacked the year before in 1990. But as far as the crimes that police knew about in 1990, 1991 and 92, he was charged with attacking all 12 of those women. He was charged multiple charges for Darlene, the survivor, like assault and attempted murder. Rape, was one of the charges. And then for the 11 women he killed, there were a couple different kinds of murder charges for each one. I'm not an expert in the law, so I couldn't tell you like the distinction between them, but a couple different kinds of like whether it involved, in the commission of a crime, criminal intent, or just like there's the different varieties of murder that the law defines.
Yeah.
And so he was, when it all came down in 1994, when he was tried, he was found guilty of just about everything. I think there was only one of the charges, and that was one of the charges for Darlene that was dropped. But everything else he was convicted of, and he received multiple mandatory life sentences under Michigan law.
Okay. Now, when they prepared him for trial and, everything kind of, this, you said that there was a lot of psychologists that assessed him. What were they thinking that was going on with him? Because it sounds like he did have kind of remorse. He felt so ashamed of himself. But now with him getting assessed, what were they saying about his assessments being, did he have like was he ever diagnosed with like anything like schizophrenia or anything like that? And maybe, obviously it's not going to take any time off of his sentence, but I'm wondering, instead of him being, is he in like a prison, or is he more in a mental health facility that's secure?
He was convicted and sent to a regular straight up prison, and he is dead now. He has passed. He had HIV, which is a whole other discussion that we could get to if you like.
Yeah.
But as far as the 4 people who assessed him after his arrest, the first one was from Detroit's Recorder's Court. That was the inner city court for Detroit at the time. It no longer exists. But that was just competency to stand trial. So that was a brief assessment. They talked about a few things from Atkins' background, but didn't really dig into a whole lot, and there was no diagnosis or anything there. So that's the first person. And then Recorder's Court did a second assessment of him under a different doctor that dug a little bit more into the details. And then the third person was hired by the prosecution, and the prosecution had to know at that point in the prep for trial that you've got a guy who has confessed to all 11 murders and 1 assault of a survivor. He also has physical evidence against him. He did have DNA evidence against him. And he has an eyewitness survivor who's testifying against him. So those 3 things are very strong things against him. And so I think the prosecution was probably anticipating that the defense would go with some kind of insanity approach. So where else do you go when you have that much against you? Although they were like, he and his defense attorney leading up to trial were basically going to try to allege that he was innocent or did not have the criminal intent, or however you want to package it, to defend him and get him cleared of these charges, which was certainly an uphill battle. And so then the prosecution hired their own person to assess him, and that doctor really dug in and found, with a lot of testing, there's the different personality tests. The one is the MMPI, Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Index, I want to say. I might not be correct on that. Very popular test, so I think still used to this day. They did that for him. Yeah, they even did Rorschach tests. They did a variety of testing of him, and the psychiatrist or psychologist for the prosecution did not diagnose him with any kind of actual mental illness. They definitely did not feel he was insane. They actually felt, based on his answers to the questions, that he was doing a little malingering, that he wasn't being truthful, that this whole hearing voices thing, they really weren't buying that. And truth be told, the whole thing of hearing voices did increase as the months went by. It started out with him when he was being questioned by police saying, "No, I don't hear voices. No, of course not," because he actually was asked that by the interrogating officer who was getting a weird vibe from him. To then each person he spoke to, he started to say, "Yes, I'm hearing voices," and he added personalities as he went along. First, it was just Tony. Then it was multiple voices. It was Tony, it was a gal named Mary, and it was a female named Mayola, who were alternate personalities living within him, he essentially was saying, or voices that were competing for his attention and egging him on. And then he even brought a dog into it at one point, which is kind of a humorous aspect of the case, that some people have imaginary pets when they're kids. Well, when he was talking about hearing voices, he also said he saw a dog. There was a dog there too that he called Pete sometimes, and then it had different names at other times. So we went from no voices to 3 voices and a dog before his trial. So
oh my gosh, he's going the Son of Sam way or what?
I mean, you have to wonder. So then we have the 4th person to analyze him was for the defense. And this person came in, this professional came in with, I think, probably the defense attorney's earnest hopes that, "Can't you please find him? Can you find him insane?" He's probably thinking that. He's not telling the professional this, but he's hoping, okay, there's got to be something going on with this guy. I mean, especially, you could argue that even if you're not insane, if you're pretending to hear voices, don't you have something strange going on? You could argue that. There's definitely something going on with you. But so the psychologist for the defense did not go so far as to say that Benjamin was insane. But here's where an actual diagnosis comes in. He did diagnose him with what he called splitting. Not split personality, but splitting, a borderline personality disorder, where he did find that was going on with Benjamin, that it was like a disassociation thing. In fact, Benjamin told him that as he was killing these women during this several month spree of killing these 11 women, that he would hear about the murders on the news. He would hear when police had found one of these women, and it wouldn't really click with him that he had done that. He was like disassociating himself with it. And so this is what the psychologist for the defense said. So I think they used that as much as they could in court. The psychologist did testify for the defense, but you couldn't come out and say this guy was insane, so you really could not get that insanity determination. And so he was convicted of everything in the end.
Okay. Well, we got to take a quick break, but that leaves me with some questions about his hearing voices and things like that. I have an idea, and I want to talk about it when we come back from the break. But we have Billy, as I'm going to call her, but we have B.R.Bates. She is the author of the Crack City Strangler, the homicide serial killer Benjamin Atkins, book number 2 in the Murder in the Motor City series. And of course, she did the other one, the baby doll serial killer. That was John Eric Armstrong. So, but we'll talk. We're going to go over these questions right after the break. Are you feeling lost, stressed, wondering if Mercury is ruining your life again, or the universe is just ghosting you? Well, you're not alone. At Love and Lotus Tarot, I keep it real. No crystal balls, no woohoo, just honest, grounded guidance to help you navigate life's chaos. Whether you need clarity on love, career, or just anything that feels like a mess, I've got you. Here's something really cool. In between tarot sessions with me, I just put out this new journal book, your very own purge journal. Don't hang on to all that angst and all that stress and all that anger. Get rid of it. Whether it's valid or not, you still have that emotion just eating away at you. So purge them onto paper, scream it, shout it, get it out. They're available right now on Amazon. Scan the QR code or click the link in the description below. Or just visit me at lovelotustarot.com and purchase your purge journal there. Visit lovelotustarot.com to book a reading, check out some of the new merch, and find the insight you've been searching for. Because let's be honest, therapy is expensive and my cards are way cooler anyways. So head on over to lovelotustarot.com now and let's figure out this thing called life together. Okay, and we're back from the break. Now, before the break, we were talking about, the psychologist, the psychiatrist that assessed Benjamin Atkins, aka Tony. Um, Now, during his episodes that he would say that he would hear voices to say, you need to kill these women, and so he would go out and do it. In those moments, was he using drugs like, crack cocaine, any type of Medicaid or drug, illegal drug, I would say, that could cause hallucinations and things like that? So maybe he was hearing voices, but it was all drug induced psychosis type of thing. So was that ever investigated during the trial or by the defense? I mean, did they try and bring that up during the trial?
Yeah, crack was his drug of choice, although he had done multiple kinds of drugs in the years leading up to that. But it was really crack that he was doing on the streets. And as far as whether or not the crack could have keyed into his crimes, I don't think it was explored by the defense. It was not part of his defense. And I don't even know how much it really came up with the prosecution. I've got some different indirect sources for the trial. The transcripts don't exist anymore, unfortunately, so I wasn't able to read through the exact transcripts, but I did have some pretty detailed notes and other reports of what happened at trial. But yeah, I don't think, you would think that the drugs would be a factor that they would talk about, especially since the very first known survivor, her name was Margie, and this was December 1990. She said that when they went off to smoke some crack, and as soon as he got high, he became a different person. And that's when he flew into a rage and he tried to kill her, and he told her he was going to kill her, and things got crazy, and she was able to get away by giving him some money to appease him. That tended to soothe him, strangely enough, and she was able to get away. But the point was that she saw a different person. She said his eyes got black. And you hear that sometimes about serial killers if they ever have a survivor. I've heard that before, that idea of when they get into that mode, when they get into that serial killing mode, their eyes get black and they become like almost demonic. That's not the first time I've heard that. So yeah, if this was drugs altering his personality, you have to wonder, well, wouldn't that come into the proceedings either for the prosecution or the defense? I mean, that drugs were a factor, but drugs ended up not being a factor for him. As far as his hearing voices and whether they could have been influenced by that, I'm not even sure. He gave different ages that he started to hear the voices. He told 3 different people 3 different ages at which he started hearing the Tony voice or feeling the Tony presence around him. So then you have to say, okay, he wasn't very sure about that now, was he? He did have a lot of difficulty with times. Like he didn't remember when any of these murders happened, like as far as month or day. He would say, well, it was the first snowfall of the season or something like that. But there was a lot of details that he got confused about the murders themselves too. But when he started hearing these voices, and the fact that he never told anybody he knew, like his brother or anybody else, evidently no one had ever heard about the whole voices thing, no one he knew. So that also makes you wonder, okay, was this completely fabricated after he was arrested? But yeah, you do really have to wonder where these voices, the concept of the voices, if he genuinely did hear them, where all that came from in his brain.
Yeah, well, you see people. Have you ever witnessed somebody who is really tweaking out on meth? I mean, they're paranoid. They think people are following them. It's all those kind of things. So it's obviously they feel like somebody's following them or watching them, because that's why they're paranoid. So, and I don't know much about crack cocaine, except that it was just a drug that that was cheap and it was in the inner cities.
Hmm.
But I'm wondering if that's what it was putting him in, a drug induced psychosis. And it changed his personality. It changed who he is. And a lot of serial killers, it's like a switch. And once it's flipped, Ted Bundy,
Yep.
for instance, a lot of people said Ted Bundy's face, his eyes would look black. And there was even people said that he would emit the sulfur smell for some reason.
Oh, that is
Yeah,
creepy. Wow, talk about demonic.
right. Oh God, I know, and it's Ted Bundy, so it's not like he has a record. But yeah, and I would think as a defense attorney, not to say that it gives him an excuse to do, what he did. I mean, what he did was wrong. I feel like back then we made such a mistake on not really looking at people back then and trying to see where the patterns are to prevent things like that from happening. Eventually now we do more case studies and stuff like that when it comes to psychological issues, especially with people who do things out of the norm, like mothers who kill their children or serial killers. I feel like he should have got a different type of imprisonment, and I feel like we could have learned from people like that a lot sooner rather than later. Now, one question I do have though, when you were researching this book, what was what hit you emotionally the hardest? I mean, like that you were just like, oh my God, this is horrible. Like, was there something in his story that really got to you that way?
Um, yeah, there's a couple different things. For me, what always hits me, what hit me with both of these cases I've researched are the women, the women who lose
Hmm.
their lives, because I relate to them much more than I ever would have thought. I've never
Hmm.
done sex work myself, but I, in learning more about them, each and every one of these women, their lives all started out in ways that you wouldn't imagine. Very normal ways, normal families with a mom and dad at home, siblings, a neighborhood where you
Hmm.
play with the kids down the street and all of that, normal upbringings. And I think we have this stigma, or we have this perception of women in sex work that they were I don't know, born in a cave or hatched out of an egg or whatever. I don't know what
Right.
people assume, but they assume that they were like born into that work or something. No little girl wants to be a prostitute when she grows up.
No,
So
no.
there's the story of the women, and what I found is that a lot of them, or almost all of them, if not all of them, had very normal lives at one point, but they had a wrong turn or two, and almost always it's addiction. It is addiction that
Right.
puts them out there in the street. And we have a lot of addiction in this country. So I was always struck by the women in this case, and looking at them as human beings. But I'll tell you, in this case, unlike the other one, I had so many good files to draw from, but I actually held in my hands at one point. I had borrowed the files from one of the people involved in the case, and I had these letters that Atkins wrote to his brother's girlfriend while he was in jail in his lead up to trial. And they're just a few different letters on yellow ruled paper, and they're
Okay.
handwritten to this brother's girlfriend. And in those letters, because he no doubt knew that everybody was reading his mail, the personnel at the jail, the Wayne County Jail, were reading his mail and whatnot. He knew he was being watched. And so, but you could argue it
Hmm.
either way. Maybe it was genuine, maybe it was malingering, but he would pretend he was writing these letters to this girlfriend, brother's girlfriend, and he would start out saying, "Hey, how you doing?" Yada yada, but he would talk about his tortured soul a lot. Talk
Hmm.
about being told by Tony to. He actually did it while he was in jail in the lead up to
Oh,
trial. But he also would write like a segment of the letter where he said he was the demon speaking through Tony Atkins, and he would say, "Hey, this is Tony. I'm in control of Benjamin." That whole sort of thing. So it would alternate between Benjamin writing and Tony / the demon writing, and then Benjamin writing again. And I've got quite a bit of those letters in the book that people can read what he actually said. I'm badly paraphrasing right now. But, I would review the case files, and I found that at the end of the day, when I was getting ready to go to bed, I would crawl into bed with some of those paper copies, and I would make electronic copies of them and review them again the next day. But I would do the initial pass while I was relaxed at the end of the day, while I was decompressing. And some would argue, that's crazy. Why would you do that? Give yourself
I know. I'm the same way. I'm like, I need to go relax. I'm going to go watch some Dateline.
Exactly. And I'm a big fan of true crime television too. But I just found that to be the most interesting. I found when I was crawling into bed at night with these files in front of me, I was just absorbing a lot of initial impressions. And then I would go second pass, a deeper dive the next day in front of my laptop. So I'm sitting there holding on to these sheets of yellow ruled paper and an actual sheet of paper that he held in his hand that he hand wrote on, and just having the weirdest surreal feeling like I'm holding the same page that he held, and what is it? What is the vibe I'm getting from this? I don't even know how to explain it, but it was just chilling and very unsettling just reading this, because even if he is what you would consider malingering, like I said earlier, you could argue there's something off about that. There's still something off about a person who feels the need to do that. So that, I would say, is something that stands out to me about this research.
Yeah. And it's like they use it as a survival tactic. I mean, they're chameleons. They can adapt to whatever environment they're in. And when you add, I guarantee you, if I had $1 million, I'd put all in that probably the crack cocaine caused him to flip that switch. And I know people who are long-time drug users, especially the drugs that can cause effects in the brain, like hallucinations, hearing voices, psychosis, paranoia, that permanently damages your brain. And sometimes where it damages, it's almost like it just permanently puts it in your brain now. It's like you just all of a sudden have schizophrenia out of nowhere because of the drugs. I actually had a former family member who basically drugged himself so much to the point where he's mentally handicapped now.
Wow.
Oh my goodness. I mean, like, he really killed his brain cells. And and on top of that, having a child growing up, having to deal with probably depression, sexual abuse, on top of all that, that's just an atom bomb waiting to go off. And and when people fall through the cracks like this is what happens. Now, when he was found guilty on the charges, did he address the family members of the victims, and did he apologize, or did he just kind of turtled himself in a shell and just didn't want to face the world anymore?
Yeah, he did not apologize. The closest he came to it in court, he did tell everyone, and you did have quite a few family members of the victims in court. He said something to the effect, "I'm sorry for what they went through, but this whole trial process has been killing me." And it was more like directing it back toward what he was going through and not really admitting that he was the perpetrator. I'm sorry for what you went through, but me, but I. So
but I have to deal with all this too.
God. I mean, wow. So that was the closest he ever came to not actually apologize for his crimes. No.
That's what drugs can do to you. I mean, and it's a shame. He was a victim of his circumstance. He grew up in inner city, poor, mother who's a prostitute. It's just, it's that perpetual systematic failure that just keeps cycling through generation after generation.
Oh,
And
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, his
now,
mom, in looking at the background of his mom, she actually was raised by her grandmother. So that kind of tells you, I mean, when a child is raised by their grandparents, there's something going on with the parents. So this was at least like third generation stuff going on.
yeah. Yeah. Well, now, has there been any improvements? I mean, have you looked at any improvements within Michigan state law when it comes to mental illness and things like that in cases like these?
Not that I can see, but no, I really haven't looked into that.
Okay.
As far as how things feel, I don't think I've known anybody who's been close to those sort of situations. So yeah, it is a system that needs reform, but has it seen any reform in the decades since then? Because this has been 30 some years since all this happened. I really couldn't tell you.
Yeah, and that's always the thing. It's, are we learning from these situations to prevent it from happening, down the road? Especially now today with all the different, you have fentanyl, you have all these drugs just floating around, and these kids are taking it and they're going crazy. I mean, we really need to like hone down in on that aspect of things, because I feel like pumping these drugs out into people who live in poverty, and more likely they've been abused, they've been neglected, and then throwing the drugs in there, that's, I think, where we need to start, because it's putting people in positions where they don't look at humans as humans anymore. I mean, it's like a free for all, killed or be killed. And it's sad. And
Addiction is such a huge issue. And what you said earlier about the idea that the drugs wreck your brain, kill your brain cells, I had to think of that commercial. There's a reason they made that commercial in the 1980s about the frying egg in the pan. This is your brain on drugs. And it's exactly what you said too. It does fry your brain.
Yeah, I mean, it was to the point where he couldn't take care of himself anymore, because mentally it was like he became this, adult child. And you have to think, it's like, okay, well, if it can do that to a brain, it can cause these people to have these kind of episodes. And, and it's sad that there's probably a lot more people just like Benjamin that were out there, maybe not, going on a murder spree, but that perpetual living a life of crime and, prostitution. And it's so sad, because if you feel like that's what they feel they have to do to survive.
Oh yeah, it was about survival, definitely.
Yeah, and and putting that kind of pressure on people and living in a society like that. I mean, everybody's just probably just on edge 24/7. And then you throw drugs in there. It's just, oh, but, well, thank you so much for coming on today with me, Billy. I was shocked by when I saw this book come up that I never heard of this guy. And I'm like, this is a very different kind of case. Yes, he could be gay, but what stuck out to me was he was African American. And it was like he just all of a sudden went on this murder spree and killed so many women in a short period of time. And that kind of baffled me. So I wanted to look more into it. And of course, the mental illness came up. So I like to look at those backgrounds. So that way, if any of my listeners are in situations like that, or see situations that they're, associated with a family, a friend, or whatever, they can have some education on it, or at least have a keyword to Google about it. That's what my show is all about. So again, the book is The Crack City Strangler. I'll have a link for that in today's description. Now, do you have a website at all?
I do. I have B.R.Bates.com. That's the main website. And then I also have a blog, and it's at blogger.com or blogstom. And if you just Google from the keyboard of B.R.Bates, it'll come up at blogger or blogspot.com. And then I'm on Instagram and YouTube as well.
Well, that's awesome. And I'll put a link to your author's page as well. So that way people have a quick way to go and check out all your other works, which I'm definitely going to go start going through so I can see which one I can have you on again with. But of course, yeah, I do want to talk about that John Eric Armstrong, the baby doll serial killer. That one's very interesting. So make sure you check out all the links and please rate and review these books. It helps these books get seen more and more on Amazon or when people are searching for it. Okay, now I'm interested and have to go down this rabbit hole on the effects of crack cocaine on the human brain and human behavior. Crack cocaine symptoms and warning signs. Now, the initial effects of crack cocaine are intense and have a quick onset. When crack is smoked, the user experiences a rush of euphoria and energy, but these effects only last just a few minutes. Then the user will start to feel agitated and will likely keep taking hit after hit to try and chase that euphoric first high. Now, chasing that initial rush off the first hit of crack cocaine is typically the start of how crack cocaine addiction is developing. There are signs and symptoms of crack cocaine use. Usually people exhibit overconfidence and hyperactivity, but other signs include dilated pupils, aggressive behavior, restlessness, increased breathing rate, uncharacteristic irresponsibility, burned or cracked lips or fingers. Now, eventually, users may develop a mental obsession with crack cocaine and be unable to hold a regular conversation or complete simple daily obligations due to their psychological dependence on the crack. Now, due in part to the unpredictability of the drug's contents, the effect of smoking crack can vary from person to person. Crack effects are both physical and psychological, and the severity increases the more a person smokes. Some immediate side effects of crack abuse include aggression, restlessness, anxiety, increased heart rate and blood pressure, seizures, pressured speech, dilated eyes, loss of appetite, disturbed sleep patterns, increased body temperature, nausea, intense cravings to use more, stroke, heart failure, potential death from respiratory failure, and coke bugs, a feeling of bugs under your skin. Now, if this isn't psychological, I don't know what is. Now, even long-term effects of abusing crack can be detrimental. Long-term crack abuse can cause damage most likely to the body's vital organs such as your liver, kidneys, and heart. Additionally, crack cocaine users are more susceptible to infections because of the drug compromises their immune system. But the dangers of long-term crack abuse also include depression, permanent damage to the blood vessels, high blood pressure, liver damage, lung damage, abscesses, malnutrition, severe tooth decay, reproductive damage and infertility, exhaustion, irritability, increased frequency of risky behavior, psychosis, paranoid behavior, kidney failure, stroke, heart attack, and death. Now, considering how destructive the consequences of this drug is, the availability of widespread of crack can be very surprising. According to a survey conducted in 2010, children as young as 13 have been exposed to the crack cocaine. In fact, 23% of 8th graders, 32% of 10th graders, and 45% of 12th graders have reported that crack was very easy to obtain. Considering that one hit can spark a lifelong addiction, these numbers help illuminate the severity of this issue. Now, this comes from the website addictioncenter.com. Now, you can't tell me that Benjamin Atkins, while he was high on crack cocaine, he wasn't having these psychosis, these personality changes, hearing voices. It sounds very much like what crack cocaine can do to the brain. Same with meth. I don't understand how people can just put these unknown chemicals in their body just to get this high. I mean, how desperate do you have to be to I guess, scratch that itch? And to know that crack bugs, gross, feel like you have bugs crawling underneath your skin. Oh my God. That's a hallucination. So obviously, him being on the crack was probably the catalyst that caused him to go on a murder spree. And I'm not saying, that's an excuse for what he did, but maybe we could have learned from that case back in the mid 90s, and we would be better off today in society and not have this systemic drug abuse, poverty, and just this recipe for disaster. So I thank you all so much for joining me. I'll definitely have to have B.R.Bates back on, aka Billy, for her other book of The Baby Doll Killer. That one sounds very interesting. So I hope to see you guys all next week. Thank you for joining me for another episode of Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot. And until our next case, my armchair detectives, stay safe, stay vigilant, and stay aware. I'll see you right here next week on Mysteries, Mayhem, and Merlot.